I'm Jonathan. I'm going to say a bit more about myself in a minute, and Steve's here too. And Steve and I have prepared this in great detail, and it's going to be a highly slick presentation. But I can't remember, Steve, whether you or I were starting. I think it's me, isn't it?
That's correct. And
okay, yeah, good. I'm doing the right thing. So Steve and I are going to talk about this event that we were part of, that we co-organized with others, the title of which was A Trouble Walks into a Bar. And the kind of theme was about mental health, telling stories, finding ways to tell stories differently about mental health and mental illness. And we're going to talk you through that event and the planning of it and the thinking behind it, the conceptualizing of it in some detail, because we think the kind of process of setting it up was really interesting. Certainly was really interesting for us and the kind of conversations we had. And we'll talk you through who was involved in the event itself, which ended up being at the Stand Comedy Club on York Place in the days when you could gather in small places and be close to each other. So that's the plan. We've got 45 minutes, I understand, and we're going to have some time at the end for hopefully for any conversations you might want to have with us. So we're going to talk for the next 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll stop and see where we've got to. And I think what I'm doing now is just saying just a little bit about myself and what my connection is with this event that Steve and I are going to talk about. So I'm Jonathan Wyatt. I am work at Edinburgh University. I'm Professor of Qualitative Inquiry, and I'm in, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, and I'm in a department that's called Counselling and Psychotherapy, or Counselling, Psychotherapy and Applied Social Sciences. And I'm also the director of a research centre called the Centre for Creative Relational Inquiry. And CCRI, as we call it, is interested in research in research that's about people's experience, broadly speaking. So qualitative research that's about investigating, interested in exploring how people experience whatever it might be. And so CCRI is fostering creative and innovative ways of doing this kind of research. This event we're going to talk to you about is connected with CCRI and what CCRI does. My own personal connection with this event, and then with this conversation with Steve setting it up, was that my background as a professional background is as a therapist and a psychotherapist, and I wrote a book about the connections between stand-up comedy and therapy. Less about how stand-up might or might not be therapeutic, and much more about the kinds of stories that people tell in stand-up and how they echo the kinds of stories that people tell in therapy. And I wrote that book a couple of years ago, and it came out last year, and that's what kind of Steve and I picked up on in our conversations. So that's probably enough from me. That kind of hopefully leads into Steve being able to say something about him.
Yeah, an award-winning book I hear.
It is. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. So hi there. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Steve Earl. I suppose my background sits on collaborative innovation, mostly around how we collaborate on new ideas or existing ideas and how we work together to do that. And I've done that for as long as I can remember now. But my current role is at the University of Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, where I look after the futures and challenge ecosystem there, which is a kind of buzzword for just saying that how I convene people to come together to talk about current challenges and issues and explore the kind of futures that we want to choose or be part of. As part of that convening, I suppose I've got a facilitation background as well, as many of you probably do as well. And I suppose this is kind of a little bit of where the story starts, but there's lots of little paths along the way. And one of those was maybe a couple of years ago, maybe even only a year ago. It feels so long since we were meeting in person, but I was in Berlin on a workshop, and I'd started to see a pattern in a lot of the events that I went, how there was a very limiting way that we could have very difficult conversations collectively. And I was noticing the very sad and serious narratives were really getting on top of anything, and they would actually anchor a lot of the collective work. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I just noticed that as a pattern that I would like to explore other more playful ways to start unpacking that. And oddly, I was speaking with Karen, who's on the call as well, about this, and she was just like, "Oh, have you spoke with Jonathan, who happens to be doing a lot of work around comedy and his extended role through Cree as well, or Cry, sorry, See Cry." And so oddly, I'd reached out to him earlier for another subject, but and we managed to get together. But in parallel to that, there was other discussions with one of EFI's, the Edinburgh Futures Institute's intern, Rue, who I was having this very similar conversation in parallel around this. And one of the ambitions we had together was to try and think about how EFI or myself and Rue could, as a little seed, start thinking about like when we have these types of events, and what responsibility could EFI have in these events to like really create an experience and a feeling of a subject that, you know, can somewhat transform people as they come to experience these things. And or as a minimum, like when they leave, they've got this kind of sense of nostalgia that of the subject or the experience of itself. And so that left us to, I suppose, to pass over back to Jonathan. Like I was reaching out to Jonathan as a little seed of an idea, or at least a conversation to start to see where it could go.
So we met and began this conversation, and I mean, I'm obviously going to telescope the story somewhat for the sake of time, but we tried to work out how we might, and I suppose we quite quickly landed on a shared desire to put on some kind of event to kind of make use of the idea about how stand-up or quasi stand-up events and settings and contexts might be a way of attending to something serious, as Steve says, in a more playful way. And we talked about the examples that we know of performers of various kinds who address really serious subjects through stand-up or through storytelling in other ways. And so we kind of fairly quickly settled on the idea of running an event, of putting on an event, and talked about the ways in which we might do that. And this is quite a very kind of rushed version of the story. But what we spent a lot of time talking about was how would we combine the fun of the playfulness, the serious playfulness of stand-up, who might we get, who might be there around, who might be able to we might be able to draw from, who does that kind of work that might help us to run an event that opens up conversations about mental health and mental ill health in a way that people find engaging and affecting, moving, and playful all at the same time. Who's out there? What kind of performers might we look to? And what kind of an event might it be? Is it going to be just, when I say just, I don't mean that to be belittling, but just a stand-up event? Or are we looking to try and do something else, something more, something different with that? And some of the conversation was then also about what kind of an event works, how and crucially also where might it take place, because the setting, the context, the room is so important in any kind of event, but thinking about the kind of event we were beginning to bring together. So those were the conversations we were having, and what we landed on was trying to find a way to run an event that combined stand-up performances with some storytelling that may not be stand-up. Of course, stand-up is also storytelling, or can be, but stand-up and storytelling and also discussion. And that was partly, I think, mostly the kind of difficult elements of this kind of an event, of how would you construct an event, curate an event that enables those different things to happen, particularly the kind of shift in energy between stand-up comedy and storytelling. And well, I mean, stand-up comedy and storytelling, perhaps that transition's less problematic, but certainly it's the kind of transition between storytelling and then discussion. So we had a lot of discussion talking about that to try and settle on a format that might work, which we really kind of continued talking for quite some weeks about in the various meetings that we had. Shall I pause there, Stephen?
Yeah,
you pick up maybe something about the title and what we then did.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you summarized that really well. Because we spent a lot of time knowing there was something we desperately wanted to do together, but we didn't exactly know what. And a lot of those things were unpacking what each of us thought and trying to get somewhere. But we definitely knew there was the energy to continue and to explore that, and that's what kind of anchored us together. And so that kind of and taking it from there is essentially where we've ended up, because we started exploring, once we started to understand that we definitely wanted a performance piece, we definitely wanted something that helped explore different types of narratives, and we definitely wanted some kind of discussion or participation or some kind of agency from the from the observers, which are the audience. There we go. I knew there's an easier word for that, to be part of that. And so once we started doing this, we did settle on these, and we started reaching out to some networks that we thought could help us with that. And one of the ones we thought, well, from the comedy, well, okay, so we've got both myself and Jonathan perform stand-up through Bright Club, which is an organization nationwide, but there's one in Edinburgh that is about academics who do stand-up based on the research, which is more straightforward and absolutely hilarious, and you should go when you can, as soon as possible. And so we reached out to them to see if there's performers, but we also knew another charity locally, Real Talk, that uses storytelling to explore and help support mental health. And so we reached out to them to see if they would have performers willing to be part of this. And very fortunately for us, they said yes. But I suppose a more key one was we were reaching out to think about, well, where are we going to hold this? And we ambitiously thought, well, I wonder what the stand, a comedy club, would say to this. And luckily we had a few ins there from a few past events that I'd organized myself. And so luckily Susan Morrison came along and helped with that. But then there was just a little bit of trying to figure out, well, okay, so stand-up comedy clubs, wonderful for comedy, probably very good for storytelling, but they're really set up for an audience to consume these stories, not just take part. And so what are we going to do in that venue to restructure for those types of events? And so we had a really big hope of thinking about what a fishbowl conversation is, where you can put people in the middle, the performance or a group or discussion in the middle, and the audience can be around. And so we had a lot of play trying to think how we can actually do that. And I'll come back to that, but it was one of our main things. But I guess, how long did we spend on just before I forget, because I nearly forgot about the title there, because we spent a lot. We eventually ended up with A Trouble Walks Into a Bar. And we spent a lot of time trying to think about the exact wording for this, because we didn't want to frame things such as, we didn't want to anchor too much on, say, individual things or individual parts of mental health or even trauma in itself. And we thought there was just, and we wanted to include the spectrum of why people would want to explore these subjects as well. And so luckily we came across a wonderful title suggested by you, I think, Jonathan, around A Trouble Walked Into a Bar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so just trying to think about how we play. Oh, I don't mean to explain the kind of pun and the joke to you, but it's where it is. And do you want to say something there, Jonathan?
No, you carry on. I'll hold on.
Yeah, that's fine. And the only other thing that I was going to extend that to was just thinking about the discussion, because we wanted to invite other mediums into that. And so one of my close friends, Pam Vanderberg, was she runs a program or a charity called Conversations for Change, where she's an artist by background, and does and she explores art conversations as art, and does lots of public and private interventions based on her arts. And so we wanted to make sure that she was part of that discussion as well, so we could start to get a nice flow around these and start capturing these. And I guess most of that was starting to think about how we then program that, because what we also did was that we offered each of those, like the Bright Club performance who came back, we managed to get some there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we offered them some training to make sure they're there. Luckily, they all felt very confident, so we didn't need to offer that training, but it was there. And the same with Real Talk. Lily, the founder, she offered some training for those storytellers, which they took up. And so there was a couple of days training those stories, pulling out those stories that were very relevant for those performers. And I guess this is a good point to think about how it all went down. Jonathan, do you want to take over from there?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. Just a couple of things to add to what you're saying, Steve. One of the possible alternative titles was A Trauma Walks into a Bar. We've played with that for quite a long time, and it's an example of how we didn't want the event to be a kind of pathologizing or narrow. And the idea of trouble is that actually all of us can identify we've been troubled and having troubles. So it meant something much more open than a trauma, which obviously would have focused on the experience of trauma, which is which maybe that we wanted to be inclusive of that, but not exclusive of other experiences of being troubled.
Absolutely.
To put it very broadly. I want to respond just also in this bit to Maria's question, which was in the text box, which is about how important the stand was. And I want to say that I think that holding it at the stand felt really crucial to it. I mean, it could have run somewhere else, but there was something about the space. If you know the stand, it's a basement. It's a basement space. It's quite small, but it accommodates 150 people or so. We were more or less full. I mean, they didn't open up all of the stand, I don't think, but we had 91 people sign up for it. So it felt like, well, it felt a busy and energetic, crowded place with the expectation that comes with an afternoon of comedy. I know I'm jumping ahead a bit here, Steve, but the event was held at 4:30 in the afternoon till 6 o'clock. It's not the ideal time for a stand-up, that kind of an event, but it was February, so it was dark, or more or less, and there was this sense of an occasion and an event. So it would have been possible to run it somewhere else, but my experience of being there was that the sense of occasion and event that's engendered by being in that space was really crucial to it, which is not to say that it couldn't happen online as well. It would just become something different and would need to be curated differently, I think. Steve, so I'll just talk very briefly about what the structure was. I'm aware of the time we've got. So you're nodding, so I'm going to go ahead. So what the structure that we landed on was that basically Steve opened the event, introduced everybody. Then the first segment, there were 3 segments to the whole event. The first segment was storytelling, which a lead person from Real Talk introduced, Alette Willis, who's a director of Real Talk. So she introduced it. Then there were, I think, two storytelling performers. And then there was a break. And the bar was open, by the way. That was also, it wasn't so much that there was alcohol there. I don't think that was the issue, but somehow the bar being open and there being the kind of social buzz helped. So there was a break of 10, 15 minutes. And then Susan Morrison, who, those of you who don't know, she's a very well-known, established Scottish comedian. She was hosting it. She's very supportive of Bright Club and other events, similar events, and she was very keen to be part of this event. So she, as a professional comedian, was the MC for the Bright Club for the comedy segment. And there was so Susan did her thing, and then there were, I think, three stand-up performers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, I'm looking at 4 stand-up performers. And that then was followed by another break. And then there was what Steve described as the fishbowl discussion, where there were 3 of us effectively in the audience. We didn't use the stage for this. We positioned the 3 of us in the center of the audience, facing each other. And that was Alette Willis from Real Talk and myself, and the colleague that Steve mentioned, Pam van den Broek from Conversations for Change. And then the audience was kind of around us. Susan Morrison emceed, chaired that aspect of the event too, and had the microphone and passed the microphone initially to each of us, the 3 of us in the middle, to speak from our perspective. So I spoke a little bit about the book, Alette spoke a little bit about storytelling and Real Talk, and Pam van den Broek spoke about Conversations for Change and a particular project. And then Susan chaired a discussion from members of the audience. The idea that we had was that people would come and join us in the fishbowl in the middle. And I think that happened once or twice, but actually because of the crampedness of the conditions, that didn't always happen, and people spoke from where they were. So Susan walked over to them and gave them the microphone, and they responded or asked questions. And then that was the end of the event. And I'll stop there, Steve, and I probably overlooked various things that you might have wanted to say.
Yeah, I guess you have, and I guess I'll just paraphrase some of those as well, because I suppose that introduction for me, so I suppose the lights came on and the stage I jumped onto, but I guess like as always, when I have to introduce things, I've ended up spending too much time planning them and then forgot that I've actually got to say something. So I've got to make something up on the spot every time. And so luckily no one noticed, and it seemed to go pretty well. But the 2 core things there, because just like I think it was Marie's question around how important was the stand as a venue. Well, it's got the other side as well, because we had kind of three things that we wanted to do at that event. One was comedy, so the stand was perfect for that. However, the storytelling and the discussion, they're not necessarily things that you do at a stand-up venue. So there was a lot of staging for myself to try and like blend those 2 types of expectations and make sure that like all those things could happen in one of those venues, i.e., especially considering that we were having the storytellers first up. We didn't want people to be like sitting there in the audience expecting to be laughing at like what could potentially be very emotional stories about people's lives. And so that was like the first mission there. But my second bigger mission was that I had to coerce people to sit in the front row of a comedy club, which was surprisingly lonely up there for those few minutes. So yeah. And I think I suppose just kind of echoing some of the things that Jonathan, like Alette from Real Talk introduced it, that like a lot of the things that we were doing, we were introducing little, I suppose, antecedents or little moments to try and help shift expectations of the audience. So we're helping and making Alette do the introduction for Real Talk and the storyteller, just to signify this as the storytelling. And we had Lubna Kerr and Claire McLean doing wonderful stories that were both I don't know how they managed it, but they managed just the perfect tone of seriousness and laughter in their very sincere stories. And Claire especially, who actually, this is something that, like, you know, you've got to have your stage face on, because Claire actually stepped in the night before because one of our storytellers pulled out. And so we were very, very grateful for Claire standing at the last minute and doing a wonderful job. And again, these breaks just to try and signify the end of that time and moving over to the comedy, which Susan really just came up and set that tone and made sure that we're definitely in comedy mode now. And so then we had the performances from Fiona Stanley, Don Stephen, and Rebecca. I can't pronounce your surname, I'm afraid. I've actually put a link into the overview of the events in the chat, actually. So if anyone wants to see a bit more detail on some of these things, you can. It's still historically up there. And I won't go into the fishbowl, because I think that's the next thing that we want to just touch on before we move over to any reflections and some questions. But the fishbowl, like, one of the things that really stood out for me, Jonathan, I don't know about yourself, was just the experience that we'd managed to convene or curate, and then the discussion they actually had a really
Yeah.
effective, like, feeling in the room. There's a shift there on how people, like, essentially connected and responded to what they'd just witnessed, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. There was the fishbowl event. Part of the event started with, as I said, with Alette and Pam and me talking, but actually quickly, I mean, and the performers were still around, but it quickly seemed to become something else, which was absolutely kind of less questions for us and much more people's responses to the experience of the event, which were profound. And I think a lot of that was picking up. There was partly, this is me. I mean, I don't know this, but they're partly picking up on the energy, I suppose, which is really intangible. I'm not sure quite how to articulate it, but the energy was one that felt to me across the whole piece, one of with a kind of openness, which was really generated by the storytellers and the stand-up performers sharing their experience. And I can see there's a question here from Karen about what did the stand-ups speak about. And actually, I can't remember specifically the stories that people told now. It was 6 months ago, and I can't remember. Maybe those of you who were there might be able to speak to that. But they were each very personal and did something else. So they weren't merely confessional. They were carefully crafted. They were funny. They were poignant, and that kind of energy was then picked up by people who were there and spoken to. People who were there spoke to their own kind of the echoes of their own experience, or in a more general way spoke about the principle of how they had appreciated that the event was able to deal with these kinds of issues in the kind of way that it did.
Yeah. Now, I guess that's, I'm cautious of the time, so I don't want to go over too much. But I guess if anyone, I guess we could put that over to anyone who was there, if they've got any thoughts on the event itself. I know Karen's there, so she's my backup. But if anyone else was there, it would be good to hear their thoughts,
including if you remember what the performers spoke about.
Well, I'll maybe just go. I do remember some of the, but funnily enough, I don't remember exactly, but I do remember people talking about their own mental health.
For sure.
Yeah. And almost the normalizing of that in terms of that everybody connected. And I felt that very strongly in the room, that when people spoke in the comedy, that people did laugh, not laughing at, but that sense of everybody recognized what was being talked about. I can't remember the particulars. Brenda was there as well. But I do, it's one of the strongest memories I've got of the festival, was being there, and being joined by colleagues and other people saying, oh my goodness, this is the most amazing event I've ever been to. And it was so strong. It was it was kind of completely unexpected. in some ways. Not that I didn't expect you to come up with such an amazing event, but I think that real balance of people's stories and their struggles and the ability to release some of that through the kind of laughter, but to be taken seriously. It's a very interesting combination of seriousness and laughter, and how they're not at polar ends. That there's something about that we can laugh, and the seriousness of the subject are there, and it felt very inclusive. Probably one of the most inclusive events I've ever been to, actually. So that's just my kind of recollections. And I remember being really glad there was a bar, because it was very near the end of Firestarter. And actually how great that was, even just to have a social aspect to it, again enhanced that kind of feeling. So I do remember it, but it's interesting, I can't quite pinpoint all of the stories and what they were about.
Yeah, I can maybe add to that as well. I attended the event too, and it was one of the fondest memories I had of Firestarter. I think it was a very strong festival, and I think I agree with what you said, Jonathan. I think it worked extremely well as well. I think because of the venue, it attracted so many people, and even having a different setting for people to meet and talk about actually quite difficult things that, especially I guess in a work setting, for example, you would never really talk about, but then you were quite removed from any of your normal settings. Being in that venue, talking about mental health in a comedy setting, I think it made it much more accessible to everyone and allowed for you to have a conversation about difficult topics with people with whom you would normally never speak about this with. So I also find it difficult to really remember what some of the stories were about, but I do remember a lady talking about some negative childhood memories, maybe even a trauma, and she had a poem which I think was threefold. So one focusing on the past, one on the present, and one on the future. And I think it was absolutely inspiring. It was obviously, from an artistic point of view, just beautifully written, incredibly clever, and everyone could really sort of identify with what was said. And again, the whole atmosphere just contributed to that.
So I mean, there's something about doing stand-up and storytelling, and as Steve said, even standing up and doing the intro, that feels risky. But there was something that made it possible for people to speak to their experience in those different ways, including yourself. I want to just respond to what you said about the comment. I think the phrasing something like, we didn't really know what was going to happen. We were just kind of making it up, which I think that's right. We kind of didn't know how it was going to be. We thought really hard,
yeah,
and in a lot of detail about order and structure. So, for example, I think we had a conversation about whether the fishbowl would come at the beginning, or whether it was better at the end. And so the kind of ordering of storytelling to stand up to the fishbowl was, we thought really carefully about it, and how to schedule the breaks. But there's something inherently unpredictable about stand up and about, in the setting that it happened, I think storytelling and running that kind of a discussion, a fishbowl event too, which kind of gave it the edge, the necessary edge to make it interesting and exciting, but also enough structure and care around it to create the possibility of something that also felt safe. So yeah, thank you.
That was one of the bigger ones. Was like we felt as though, because we'd approached experience, at least experience, people who had done it before, storytellers and comedians, that we thought mostly that was going to take care of itself. But the big one was that fishbowl, like discussion at the end. Like we were, I suppose, quietly nervous, humbly brave about exposing ourselves to that, because we really didn't know how that was going to go, other than a few questions that we'd hoped would spur a lot of other things.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan and Steve. Great to come along and talk about, because I don't think it's the easiest thing even to talk about. It's almost that bit about being there. So thank you for doing that, and for everybody who's contributed to that.